In 1974, two men arrived in Ireland from England. They were wanted by police in relation to several brutal rapes, but their reign of terror would not be left behind. In fact, it was only beginning. This is the case of Jeffrey Evans and John Shaw. So there's not a lot known about the two men's backgrounds. I worked out that Jeffrey Evans was probably born in 1943 or 1944, and John Shaw was born in 1946 or 47. They were both from Lancashire in England. Evans was fair haired, who had a slight figure. He had spent a lot of time in prison. He had 36 convictions for mainly like burglaries and theft, and he was said to be self educated, which I'm guessing happened in prison. He also liked to write poetry and play guitar. Evans was believed to be a father of three. John Shaw was an ex-miner. He was a lot bigger, broader, taller than his counterpart, and he had real dark features. He was divorced and a father of two. He had 26 convictions, and this included the attempted rape of a girl and the rape of a 14-year-old boy. The pair met in prison, and it was said that Evans was the brains and Shaw was the bronze. So in 1974, the two were wanted by Manchester police in relation to three savage rapes, one of which was the 16-year-old daughter of a Manchester police officer. The pair decided to get the boat to Ireland under false names, and they thought by coming to Ireland, they essentially thought that the Gardaí would never be able to catch them. They basically thought the Gardaí were crap. So they arrived here by boat under false names, and they needed money. So they started a spate of burglaries along the southeast of Ireland and down to the south, but they were quickly arrested in Cork and charged. So they were sentenced to 2 years in Mountjoy prison in Dublin. While in prison, the British authorities became aware that they were here, and they began the extradition process to get them back. This was in the 70s in Ireland, so it was at the height of the Troubles. So extradition processes were essentially used to get IRA members and INLA members brought, over to England to be charged with whatever different activities that they had been accused of or involved in. So essentially, the Irish government were not keen to be handing people over to the English. The British police had their fingerprints from the cases, and so they sent them over. But the court ruled that this was not enough evidence and told them that they need more. And in the meantime, they allowed Evans and Shaw to be released. So the pair essentially spent about 18 months in prison. And on the 5th of August 1976, John Shaw was released. He headed to Feathered in Tipperary to stay with Chris Outrin, so that was someone that he had met in prison. So he was staying with him, and on the 27th of August, Evans was released, and so he headed up to Feather to meet John Shaw. The following day, Saturday the 28th of August, they borrowed a car from Frank Walsh, which was like an associate of Chris Outram, and they drove to Dublin to collect some suitcases belonging to Evans that was at Houston Station. So they arrived at Houston Station at around 4 o'clock, got the suitcases, and then they had dinner in the city. They then decided to head to Brittas Bay to break into caravans. I think it was one of the places that they had done it before. So they went here. On their way, again, they stopped at Arklow for another, few drinks, and then they headed to Brittas Bay. And it's reckoned that they got to Brittas Bay at around 10, half 10. Elizabeth Plunkett was a 23-year-old from Ringsend in Dublin. She was a foreign exchange clerk. She done the exchange. On the night of the 28th, she was in British Bay with friends drinking in McDaniel's pub. McDaniel's was a real popular spot for Dubliners, especially during the summer, when they escaped Dublin to stay in the caravan parks. Unfortunately, Elizabeth had a fight with her boyfriend, and so she was upset and she left the pub at around 11 p.m. and decided to head home to Dublin. The weather was really bad and she was walking along the main street and a few cars passed her. Unfortunately, one of these cars was Shaw and Evans. So Shaw got out of the car and Evans drove by Elizabeth on his own and asked her where she was going, and she said Dublin, and so he offered her a lift and she took it. Before anybody says anything, thinks anything, we're talking about the 70s in Ireland when things like this didn't happen, and it was common for everyone to just get lifts wherever they needed to go. So yeah, so Evans picked her up, under the assumption that he was travelling back to Dublin and that he'd give her a lift. And then they picked up Shaw, another person who needed to go to Dublin. Elizabeth, told them that she'd had a fight with her boyfriend, but she quickly became suspicious. But before she could do anything, Shaw, who was in the back, grabbed her and started to attack her. When she started to scream, he shoved tissue paper into her mouth. Just a little while after this, Elizabeth's boyfriend, Damien, came out of the pub, to look for her. Like, he probably just thought that she went outside for a smoke or to cool off for a few minutes, just to, get away from him. But she wasn't there. And so he drove around. He actually drove around British Bay and Wicklow and looked for her, couldn't find her. And so he drove home to Dublin. And when she wasn't at home, he went back to British Bay. And again, when she wasn't, when she hadn't arrived back at the pub, wasn't, where they were staying, he phoned her dad and he phoned the Gardaí. The two men drove Elizabeth to Castletown Wood. They pulled her out of the car and dragged her over a fence and into a wood. They also brought the suitcases that they had with them. They told her to lie down, which she did. Evans told Shaw to move the car. So he went back to the car and he drove it to a pub on the Dublin Road, and then he walked back. This took about 5 hours, and when he got back, Elizabeth's hands were tied, but she was still dressed, so I don't know what happened in the 5 hours or so that Shaw wasn't there and that she was alone with Evans. They had savagely beat her. When Shaw arrived back, he took off her trousers and he raped her. During this time, Evans walked away for around 15 minutes or so and then came back. And when he came back, then he raped Elizabeth. Evans then said that he was going to go and get the car, and he told Shaw that while he was gone, he was to kill Elizabeth. And he said, remember what happened in England. While Evans was gone, and again, remember, he was gone for 5 hours, Shaw again raped Elizabeth. When Evans arrived back, Elizabeth was still alive. And so he said to Sean, why have you not killed her? Remember what happened in England, obviously implying that when they didn't kill the victims in Manchester, they were, they were going to get caught by the police. So Shaw took a shirt out of one of the suitcases and used the sleeve to strangle Elizabeth. Elizabeth died at around 6 p.m. on Sunday the 29th, nearly 20 hours after her ordeal began. The pair left Elizabeth's naked body in the woods and drove back to British Bay and broke into a few caravans. They took a lawnmower from one of the sheds, and after midnight they went back and got Elizabeth's body. They drove back again to British Bay and went out to one of the lakes, where they took one of the rowboats, and they rowed out with Elizabeth's body, the lawnmower, rope, and headed out to the sea. They tied the lawnmower to Elizabeth's body and threw her overboard, and she sank. The following morning, they burned clothes belonging to Elizabeth, and then they stayed in British Bay on the Monday night and headed back early Tuesday morning to Feathered to stay with Chris. After this, the sadistic pair decided to lay low from the guards for a while. Gardaí began investigating Elizabeth's disappearance, and several searches were organised for the different areas around British Bay. Several witnesses said that they saw Elizabeth. So, a husband and wife who were going to pick up their son who worked in McDaniel's pub said that they saw Elizabeth leave the pub. Another motorist said that he had passed Elizabeth on the road and saw that she then accepted a lift from a car. Detective Tom Connolly had been called. He was stationed in Naas Station in Kildare, and he was told to head to Wicklow to help them assist with the investigation. On the Monday morning, before the disappearance had really been, alerted to everyone in the Gardaí in Wicklow, Garda Joseph Nealon came across two men on the side of the road burning stuff. And so he didn't recognise them. He didn't recognise them from Wicklow, so he stopped and asked, what they were doing, and they just said that they were burning some rubbish. He asked, for their names, and one of them said their name was Jeffrey Murphy, and the other one said that they were Jeffrey's brother. He thought they seemed a bit suspicious. Again, he wasn't aware, obviously, what was going on with Elizabeth at the time, but he took their car details, their registration and stuff anyway. They told the Gardaí that they were staying with a friend, Chris Outram, in Tipperary in Feathered. In a search conducted in British Bay, they found a watch which was identified as Elizabeth's. In a further search, they found a pair of black boots that had, the steel caps on them, but these were held in place with brass screws, like they were screwed on, and a label that said Jeffrey Murphy. So after these discoveries, it was clear that they were dealing with an abduction. And so obviously now this was alerted out to the rest of Wicklow. I'm not sure why it took so long. But once Joseph Nealon heard about the stuff that was found and the label that said Jeffrey Murphy, he then went to the investigating officers and told them about the two men that he had seen and gave them the car details and that they were staying in Feathered. Meanwhile, on the 10th of September, after laying low for a little while, Chris drove Shaw and Evans to Limerick. From here, they made their way to Salthill in Galway. They bought a caravan. They went to Barna Caravan Park and they bought a caravan for £380. The names on the receipt were Roy Hall and David Ball. Evans travelled to Clifton, another part of Galway, and he stole a Ford Cortina 1970. This was green, so when they got it back, they hand painted it black. After a week, they also moved their caravan to a quieter part of the caravan park. So after Garda Nealon told the investigating officers about the two men, they headed to Feathered and questioned Chris. They showed him the boots and asked him did they know who owned them, and he said that Jeffrey Evans owned them. And he actually knew that Jeffrey Evans owned them because he was the one, while in prison, who fixed the cap onto the shoe with the brass screws. He also told the guards that John Shaw was with Jeffrey Evans. So now the Gardaí had the identity of the two men that they wanted to speak with. On September 22nd, the pair drove to Castlebar in Mayo. In a TV3 documentary, Cyril Killeen, a local in Castlebar, would say how on the night of the 22nd, he arrived home from the cinema with his mother and his girlfriend, and that there was a car. He said there was a car across his driveway, but it makes it sound like he drove into his driveway, so I don't know if he just means there was a car parked in front of his garden. But anyway, he thought it was really strange because he said no one ever parked there, and he knew it wasn't anybody to do. There was none of the neighbours or anybody visiting neighbours. So when he got out of his own car, he went over to the car and saw two men in it, and he just thought it seemed a bit dodgy. So he actually took the car reg down. My tripod just broke, so if you're wondering why the angle has now changed, sorry, I've had to manoeuvre my camera. So after about half an hour, after having a cup of tea and stuff, he left to drop his girlfriend home, and the car was gone. Mary Duffy was 24 and worked as a waitress in a local burger bar. On the 22nd, she finished work at around 11:30 and walked to a payphone to call her brother to tell him to come pick her up. When she phoned, he was out giving someone else a lift home at the time, a friend or whatever. So her mom or her dad, whoever answered, said, wait there, and when he comes back, I'll tell him to go in and get you. So Mary decided to start walking home, and that she would meet her brother then on the way. She lived in Belcora, which was only like a 20-minute walk. So again, this was crime was non-existent in Castlebar at the time, so this was not something that would be out of the ordinary. People walked home all the time. People hitchhiked all the time. Unfortunately, though, the payphone was visible from Cyril's house, and the men in that car were Sean Evans. At around 11 p.m., Pádraig Lyons left the pub and walked home. He said he wasn't home long. He had gone upstairs and he heard a woman scream. When he shouted down to his wife, to ask did she hear that, she opened the door, and went outside and heard a car pulling off. Evans and Shaw followed Mary for a little while. Evans pulled up behind her and Shaw jumped out and grabbed her. He hit her or punched her so hard that some of her teeth and her dentures came out, and these would be found then later on. He pulled her into the back of the car, and he and Evans drove to Ballynahinch in Galway, taking turns to drive and rape Mary in the back of the car. Apparently Mary didn't scream and she just asked them not to harm her. When they got to the woods in Ballynahinch, they tied her to a tree and they repeatedly raped her. Gardaí would say that they believed that they kept her alive like this for 24 hours. One source mentions that they would take turns to rape her and the other would go off and sleep. They had a tent or something with them, so they would go off and sleep, or they'd go off to the pub and drink. Evans apparently at one point then drove off and went back to the caravan, and he got food and pills. He also brought a concrete block with him, like a cinder block. When he got back, they gave Mary some sandwiches and water and gave her some pills. Evans apparently told her that they were sleeping pills and that he was going to take her back, assuming after she had taken them and dozed off. So she took them and she, went to sleep. And again, Evans told Sean to kill her and again said, remember what happened in England. So Shaw went to the car and he took a cushion out and went back and began to smother Mary. And then he wrapped his arms around her neck and strangled her. By this point, it was dark again. So again, they reckon it was about 24 hours. And they put her body into the back of the car along with the block and along with her clothes. Evans drove and Shaw tied the block to Mary's body. Again, they drove to a lake, and while here, Evans then must have found an anchor and tied this to Mary's body. And again, they took a boat and rowed out into the middle of the lake. They then threw Mary's body over, and with the anchor and the cinder block, she sank. Mary was wearing a couple of rings, and apparently they had taken these off her and threw them into the woods. So when Mary's brother had arrived then to pick her up, she wasn't there, and he hadn't met her on the way. So when he got home and she still wasn't home, they raised the alarm and she was reported missing. The following day, when Pádraig went to his local shop, he heard that there was a girl missing, and so it was only then that he equated the screaming to something like that, and so he went to the Gardaí. Gardaí were doing house to house searches, and so when they called to Cyril's house and were explaining the situation to him, he realised then and about the phone box and everything, and he told the Gardaí then about the car that had been parked in front of his driveway. So even though these abductions happened on two different sides of Ireland, they were so similar and they were so unusual for the areas that they knew they had to be connected. 60 Gardaí were called in to help investigate, and again, searches of the area in Castlebar were conducted. 2 days after Mary's abduction, a publican in Mahon Bridge in Connemara, uh, it was like a pub that had like the little petrol pumps outside, and so two English men arrived to get petrol, and he knew, he had saw in the paper that they were looking for two English men in relation to disappearances of two girls, and so he took the details of the car, and the next day reported them to the Gardaí. Your guess is as good as mine as to why he waited till the next day to report them. On the 26th of September, Garda Jim Boland and Garda PJ Corcoran were on parole, were on patrol in Salt Hill, and they came across the black, hand painted black Ford Cortina in the promenade parked there. So there was no one in it, and so they decided to stake it out basically until someone came along. They had called backup, and so they waited. And after a while, Evans and Shaw arrived. They had been apparently at like a hotel disco. Now again, discos back then are not like, they're not kids discos. That's what they called, like nights out clubs. And they had been at that, and they left then and arrived back at the car. And so Jim Boland drove down. So the way he drove down, they were like blocked, so they couldn't leave until he moved. So he got out, and the backup car also got out, and they surrounded the car basically and took them in. They were arrested on having having a stolen car. That's what they were arrested for, and they were taken to Eglinton Garda Station in Galway. And again, the names that they gave to the Gardaí were, of course, Hall and Ball. They were kept in their cells until the following morning. Detective Tom Connolly, that I mentioned earlier, got a call at about 1:30 that night, basically telling him that he needed to get to Galway as early as he could that morning to help question the two men. So he picked up someone else on the way, and he got there at about 7 a.m. He immediately questioned if their caravan had been searched, and so he went and searched it, but it turns out that Garda Jim Boland had also had the same thought, and he had already searched it because they thought that maybe Mary, because she wasn't missing that long, could have still been alive. And so they went there in the hopes that they'd find her, and they didn't. At about 11:30 that morning, Detective Connolly went and got Evan's clothes off him for them to be like checked or tested or whatever. And then he took Evans into an office to question him about the two women. So he asked when they had gotten the loan of the car from Frank in Feathered, where they went. And so Evans told him that they went to Houston Station in Dublin to pick up the suitcases, and that they decided then to go to Dún Laoghaire. And he said that they spent the night in Dún Laoghaire, they slept in the car, and then on the Sunday the 29th they decided to go to Wicklow. So they went to Arklow and on to Britis Bay. But Detective Connolly put it to them that their car had been spotted on Saturday 28th, not the 29th, in Britis Bay. He also said that they had the boots that he owned. They urged him to tell the truth, especially I think they were so worried about the fact that Mary could still be alive, and they were racing against the clock. But Evans was not talking. Apparently at one point, Shaw asked to go to the bathroom, and while in there he locked the door, and they realised then after a while that he had escaped through the window and gotten out. And luckily he wasn't gone far when he was on a main street, and a Gardaí happened to be coming down who knew him, and so they got him back. At around 3 or 4 a.m, Detective Tom Connolly, along with another detective from Dublin, Detective Jerry O'Carroll, questioned Shaw. So they brought him in to question him. Now this is where there's two different stories about how Shaw confesses. So basically Shaw confesses, spoiler, and Detective Tom Connolly basically says kind of what, his sounds a bit more reasonable, where he says that he says in the TV3 documentary they basically just, said to Shaw, like, we know that you did it, and just for the sake of the families, like, you need to tell us where their bodies are, you need to let us know. This type of thing, and that they kind of just coaxed him to tell them and persuade them, and that eventually he did. But Detective Jerry O'Carroll, who's not actually in the TV3 documentary, which I thought was a bit strange, he says that when they went in, he asked, was Shaw, Catholic? He asked about his children. He asked about his mother. This type of thing, and basically said like they got him to do like a prayer, that they to do prayers. And apparently, after only one Hail Mary and they were about to start a second, he broke down. Shaw broke down and just got really like screamed, and then just confessed and basically said like, the devil made me do it. And it's interesting. I don't know if he means like the actual devil, or if he's talking, figuratively of Evans, like Evans made me do it, the devil made me do it. But it's interesting that there's the two different things. So the TV3 documentary has Tom Connolly saying this, and then several news sources, Jerry O'Carroll says the other thing. But either way, good news, they got Shaw to confess. Detective Connolly would say that when he said then, like, I'll tell you, okay, I'll tell you, he said like, but will you write it down? So I don't know if that's implying, obviously, then maybe that he was illiterate. But anyway, Tom Connolly said that he would write it down. And so he went into detail about what they done to Elizabeth Plunkett and then what they done to Mary Duffy. He also agreed to show them where the bodies were. Once Evans knew that Shaw had confessed everything, then he admitted his part and everything. So later that afternoon, Shaw was brought with police to Loch Inagh, and he showed them where they got the boat. He pointed out as best as he could in the lake. He used like a buoy as a marker to kind of say like where as best he could where they dropped her body. He showed where they burned her clothes. He took them into the woods where the brutal ordeal took place. The cushion was found here. He also told them where where they threw the rings belonging to Mary. The following day, they then went to Wicklow, and again he showed them where they burned her clothes. Showed them where they stole the lawnmower. He brought them to the lake or whatever, the sea, and pointed out to the sea and basically said she's somewhere out there. He again like that went into the woods with them to show where they had where Elizabeth's ordeal had taken place, and he made a comment about how the area looked different now, and this was because such extensive searches had happened that like all the undergrowth and stuff had to have been pulled up and stuff like that, so that's why it looked different. That evening, coincidentally, Elizabeth's body washed up on the shores of Ballyteague in Duncormac in County Wexford. Unfortunately, the search for Mary's body in Loch Inagh seemed to be a lot more difficult, and so after about a week, on October the 3rd, the Gardaí actually pulled in some professional divers from the zoological department in NUI Galway, the university there, and these men were civilians. There was a couple of them, and like one of them said that they were on another mission or expedition or whatever they were doing for the college in Wexford, and they were just called back to Galway to do this one, and they weren't even kind of told what it was until they got there, and essentially then you're going in to search for the body of a girl. Like, another diver would say that that they hoped, obviously, they hoped that she would be found. They just prayed to God that they wouldn't be the one to find her. And after nearly a week, it just switched then, and they just prayed that if it meant they had to be the one to find her, just let them find her. Again, so like the lake was extremely cold, and the visibility was just so bad because it was so dark, and every time they touched anything, the dust and stuff would like fly up, and it would just make it even more difficult. And everything was done by feel. And so after another week, so like there would have been 2 weeks by this point, on October 10th, the body of Mary was finally found. While driving, handcuffed to Detective Jerry O'Carroll. They were driving to Dublin. John Shaw turned to him and said, "I'm glad you caught us, Jerry. We were going to do one bird a week." And this just became the epitome of everything. The fact that they were planning to do a lot more if they hadn't been caught. Some sources actually say that when the night that they were arrested, they had already picked out their third victim, and they were on the way back to the car to go and follow her. Essentially, the nation were horrified. Like, they were shocked. Like, as I said, these things didn't happen in Ireland. You know, they were it was very rare, and things were not going to be any easier when the trial came along for the families. So in July 1977, John Shaw was tried for the murder, rape, and false imprisonment of Mary Duffy. But his defence argued two things. The first was that the caravan had been searched without a warrant, so anything found was not admissible. The second thing was they said that Shaw had been unlawfully detained, and so that the confession, the statement he gave, wasn't admissible in court. In the 70s, back then, apparently you couldn't question someone. So how now where you might caution someone and you just question them, and then you have whatever amount of hours to either make an arrest or let them go. That wasn't a thing back then, unless you had been arrested for the under the Offences Against the State Act 1939, which was to do with things to do with like terrorism and dissident activity and stuff like that. So it wasn't to do with just normal crimes like murder or anything like that. So essentially what should have happened is you have to arrest the person, and then you have to bring them straight to court as soon as possible. So because they had been taken in on a Sunday, they should have been brought to court at like 10 o'clock on Monday morning. So Judge McWilliam threw out the statement. So the trial went ahead, and the jury didn't know anything that he had said, that he had admitted to. Like, everything we know that happened, all those awful, horrific details, is because of Shaw's confession, and the jury heard none of it, and so the jury found him not guilty. Now, during a second trial, luckily, this time the judge questioned, like, why was he not brought to court at 10:30 on Monday morning? And Tom Connolly, Detective Connolly, said that at that time they didn't know for sure if Mary or Elizabeth were alive, but particularly Mary. They said they didn't know for sure if she was alive or not, and so they needed to find where she was. They needed to find out what had happened. So the judge thought about it and ruled that the police, the Gardaí, purposely did not bring them to the courthouse, and that their constitutional rights had been infringed. But he also ruled that Elizabeth Plunkett and Mary Duffy's constitutional right to life was also infringed, and their right to life overruled their constitutional right to whatever. So he allowed the statement. So in February 1978, John Shaw was sentenced to life for the murder of Mary Duffy, and 14 years for the false imprisonment and rape. Again, I don't know why they didn't charge him with the same crimes for Elizabeth. So because the judge's ruling had then set a precedent for court cases, Evan's trial lasted a month only, and he was sentenced to life for the rape and false imprisonment of Elizabeth Plunkett and Mary Duffy. Both men were sent to Arbor Hill Prison here in Dublin. For anybody who doesn't know, Arbor Hill Prison is where our rapists and paedophiles and anything to do with sexual crimes or crimes against children, that's where they go, because if they're put in a normal prison, they will be absolutely tortured. So, unfortunately, Arbor Hill exists. In 2003, John Shaw requested a transfer to Castlereagh Prison in Roscommon, and this was granted, so he was moved there. I believe some family were worried that this was kind of, an implication that he would then be getting released after that, but it wasn't. It was just a case that he wanted to be moved. He was asked, and I don't know, I suppose he had been there so long and good behaviour and all that, they allowed him to. On Christmas Eve in 2008, Jeffrey Evans underwent heart surgery and suffered a stroke. He fell into a coma, and for the last 3 years of his life, he was in a vegetative state, and he died in May 2012. He was 69 years old and had spent 36 years in prison. He was one of our longest serving prisoners. While in a vegetative state in the hospital, he had around the guard clock, which costs around 900k a year. So with this and medical bills, he cost the state €4 million. John Shaw was transferred back to Arbor Hill. It doesn't say why. I don't know if it was his request or if something happened, but an article from this year says that he happily recycles computer parts every day. That's what he spends his day doing. And some of his fellow prisoners apparently said that they can't believe that someone as quiet as John could have committed the horrific crimes that he was convicted for and had admitted to doing. So Shaw is 73 and is currently the longest serving prisoner in the history of the Irish state. He's been in for 44 years. So Shaw is currently suing the state because they have not allowed him out for a day to shop. Yeah, so basically he either wants day releases, he wants 2 days a year, or he wants to be moved to Shelton Abbey, which is an open prison here in Wicklow. An open prison is basically, there's a lot less restrictions. It's kind of for people who are eventually going to be moved out. And like there's one prisoner who is in there and he actually works in the garden, and then he's allowed like go out to the town to do odd jobs for like locals in the town, and then that night he just comes back and goes to his room, like. So that's what Shelton Abbey is like. So yeah, so Shaw's given out because he said like he hasn't, he's in for 44 years, poor John, and hasn't been allowed out. And he basically compared it to in my very first video I mentioned Malcolm MacArthur, the Gubu murder, and he basically said that Malcolm MacArthur had been moved to Shelton Abbey and then was allowed day releases and stuff. So he was basically saying like, well, he's a murderer, so like you've let him do it. And so the Minister for Justice had always refused this request, but apparently in 2016 the parole board did say that they would recommend that he should be allowed to have 2 day releases per year. And eventually then this year the Minister for Justice said yes and agreed to it, and then Corona happened. So I don't know where that is at the moment. In all seriousness, a journal.ie article said that in a 2016 like risk assessment of John Shaw, I've pulled it up here, so I'm just gonna read it. Shaw, they found him to be at a high level risk of reoffending. Areas of particular concern to the assessors were poor problem-solving skills, negative emotionality, deviant sexual preference, cooperation with supervision, significant social influences, hostility towards women, general social rejection, and a lack of concern for others. So yeah, poor John not allowed out to pennies. In terms of, I said it earlier, like Shaw and Evans' relationship, Evans was the brains and Shaw was the bronze. And this was very evident. It was clear to Gardaí that Evans was the dominant one in the relationship, or the partnership, or whatever you want to call it. He was the one who told Shaw what to do. Just in relation to the title of the video, in case anybody is giving out about the technicalities, to be considered a serial killer, for the most part, it is 3 murders or more. They're usually scheduled, and there's cooling off periods, and then there's usually some sort of kind of like sexual or like psychological aspect to it. So for example, someone who just kills 3 people, goes to a house and kills 3 people, they're not a serial killer. It's a triple murder or whatever. It's not the same thing. Like, And then the same as, let's say, a gang member who kills 3 people in robberies or in gang initiations or whatever. Again, it doesn't have the aspect of like the sexual psychological thing, so they're not considered a serial killer. Shaw and Evans had picked out their 3rd victim. So they had killed 2 women and there was cooling off periods, albeit small ones. But they had planned their 3rd victim and were essentially stopped just before they'd done it. So the intention was there. So then they would have been serial killers. The intention was there to be a serial killer, and the intention was there to actually go on and rape and murder more women, to do one every week. If you search, we don't have serial killers really. So when you search Irish serial killers, Ireland consider these our most notorious serial killers, because we don't have a lot. And so if you Google it now, Irish serial killers, or Ireland's most famous serial killers, they will be the first that show up. I actually think that possibly Evans had been involved in more serious crimes in England, like so rapes or murders, because again, like the relationship, we know he got Shaw to do the dirty work in terms of like technically. Evans wasn't convicted of the 2 murders. He was only done for rape and false imprisonment. So what's there to say that didn't happen in England, that he, with Shaw or with someone else, that he had, built this other dynamic with someone else where he was the brains and he told the other person to do the things. Because he had 36 convictions, but they were all for like burglaries or anything. He had never been charged with rape or with murder or anything like that. And I just don't know, like, would he have escalated to rape and then to murder so quickly? I just think there's a possibility that he could have been involved in some murders over in England. So yeah, that was the story of Ireland's most notorious serial killers. Don't come at me. Evans has been dead 8 years now. His family, actually, who are based in the UK, didn't claim him or anything, so he's actually buried in an unmarked grave in one of the prisons. And Shaw is currently fighting for his right to go shopping. And yeah, today this is a lot longer and it's a lot heavier, but it's definitely an interesting case. There's just so much to it. The crimes themselves, the fact that Britain or England or whatever tried to get them back, and if they had, none of this would have happened. Legal technicalities then after for the trial and stuff. There's just a lot to it, so I thought it was an interesting case to do. So thanks for watching and thanks for listening, and we will see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.